In the hills of northern Bavaria, where forests gather like dark tides against the granite cliffs, lies a quiet village with a name once spoken in fear, Flossenburg. Today, it is peaceful, but from 1938 to 1945, this was the site of one of the Nazi regime's brutal concentration camps, a place built not simply to imprison, but to grind human lives into stone. More than 100,000 men and women passed through its gates. Tens of thousands died. The landscape that now feels calm once shook with the thunder of quarry blasts, the shouts of SS guards, and the relentless grinding of forced labour. This is the story of Flossenburg, the stone that was mined, the lives that were broken, and the silence that followed. The origins of the camp lie not only in Nazi ideology, but also in their architectural ambitions. Hitler and his inner circle imagined a Reich reborn in granite and marble, monumental structures stretching across the cities of Germany. To build these dreams, they needed enormous amounts of stone. The SS, already expanding its control over economic enterprises, created a company called the German Earth and Stone Works under Heinrich Himmler's direction. They exploited concentration camp prisoners as slave labour for quarrying. Flossenburg, with its enormous granite deposits, was chosen as one of the sites where this program would take shape. Construction of the camp began in May 1938. The first prisoners were brought in to build their own barracks, fences, guard towers, and workshops. They worked with crude tools under constant surveillance, hungry, exhausted, and beaten. By the end of 1938, several barracks stood. The wire was strung. The SS quarters were finished. The camp was ready to receive more prisoners, and what had begun as a small forced labour installation soon grew into a vast and deadly system. The prisoners who arrived in the early years were mostly Germans, political opponents of the Nazi regime, men labelled as social, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others targeted by discriminatory laws. But as Germany invaded Poland, the Soviet Union, France, and the rest of Europe, Flossenburg rapidly expanded. Prisoners began to arrive from across the continent. Poles seized during mass arrests, Soviet soldiers captured on the front, Czechs and French resistance fighters, Jews who survived earlier deportations, Sinti and Roma, Italians who opposed Mussolini, and many others. By 1945, people from more than 30 nations had endured imprisonment here. Life inside the camp was defined by hunger, cold, disease, fear, and exhaustion. Prisoners slept in wooden barracks on thin straw sacks or bare boards. The bunks were stacked 3 high, crammed with bodies. Heat was scarce. Hygiene was nearly impossible. Water was limited. Lice and fleas spread relentlessly. Dysentery, tuberculosis, and typhus haunted the barracks. For many prisoners, their greatest enemy was not the SS, nor even the harsh labour. It was starvation. Rations were meagre, watery broth with a few vegetable scraps, hard bread sometimes mixed with sawdust, ersatz coffee that offered no warmth. Hunger gnawed at prisoners until their bodies were consumed by weakness, and even the strongest collapsed. At the heart of the camp was the granite quarry. It dominated daily life. Prisoners marched there at dawn, cold and weary, often barefoot or wearing wooden clogs that slipped on ice and stone. The work was brutal. They broke stone with heavy hammers, lifted massive blocks, loaded carts, pushed them along rails, and performed dangerous tasks with inadequate tools. The quarry walls echoed with shouts, blows, and the groaning of straining bodies. If a prisoner slowed down, he was beaten. If he fell, he might be kicked until he rose again or left where he lay. Some prisoners collapsed from exhaustion and never stood again. Winter made the quarry even deadlier. Snow and ice coated the ground, and the cold cut through the thin prisoner uniforms. Frostbite, hypothermia, and exhaustion were commonplace. Many prisoners died before noon. Granite dust filled the air with every hammer strike, coating lungs and worsening respiratory diseases. The air itself became a weapon. As the war grew, so did the camp. What began as a single installation became a network of more than 100 subcamps stretching across Bavaria, Saxony, and Bohemia. Many subcamps were located near armaments factories, where prisoners were forced to manufacture weapons, ammunition, aircraft components, and equipment vital to the German war effort. Flossenburg became a hub of forced labor for Messerschmitt aircraft production. The demand for skilled labor drove the SS to fill the camp far beyond capacity. New prisoners arrived daily. Barracks overflowed. Disease spread without restraint. By 1944, thousands of prisoners arrived from other collapsing camps. As Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, and Plaszow were evacuated, columns of emaciated prisoners were forced on death marches westward. Many were brought to Flossenburg. They entered the camp already near death, frostbitten, starved, weak, and traumatized. The overcrowded barracks could not hold them. Many fell ill. Many died nameless. The death toll in the final months of the war dwarfed all previous years combined. Punishment in Flossenburg was cruel and constant. The SS established an execution yard near the laundry building where thousands were shot. Soviet prisoners of war were murdered here by the hundreds. Resistance fighters, political prisoners, Jews brought specifically for execution. Many were executed on arrival, often without registration. Their names lost death by hanging also took place, often in front of other prisoners as a warning. One of the most well-known victims was the German pastor and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Arrested for his role in supporting the resistance against Hitler, Bonhoeffer became part of the secret network within the German military intelligence service that worked to undermine the regime. After the failed assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20, 1944, the conspirators were hunted, imprisoned, tortured, and eventually condemned. Bonhoeffer was transferred to Flossenburg in April 1945. On April 9th, just weeks before the end of the war in Europe, he and several other resistance members were executed. Witnesses later recalled that he met his fate with calm and dignity. By early 1945, chaos enveloped the camp. Allied forces approached from the west and south, while Soviet advances in the east forced the evacuation of other camps, pushing thousands of prisoners toward Flossenburg. Disease raged. Food dwindled. Bodies were piled outside the barracks each morning. The crematorium burned constantly. The SS struggled to maintain order, yet they continued to beat, torture, and kill. In mid-April 1945, as American forces approached, the SS ordered the evacuation of Flossenburg. More than 15,000 prisoners were forced on death marches into the forests and mountains. They stumbled along dirt roads, across fields, through villages. Anyone who could not continue was shot. Many prisoners escaped along the way. Some were helped by locals risking their lives, while others were betrayed and handed back to the SS. The remaining prisoners who stayed behind in the camp, those too sick or weak to march, waited in terror, not knowing whether the SS would kill them before fleeing. But the SS guards slipped away in the night. On April 23, 1945, American troops entered Flossenburg. The soldiers found hundreds of starving prisoners, some barely able to stand, others dying. Medical teams arrived quickly, but many were beyond saving. Liberation came too late for thousands. After liberation, the American soldiers moved through the camp in stunned silence. The sight that greeted them was one they would never forget. Rows of bodies laid on the ground, the gaunt faces of survivors staring with hollow eyes, and the smell of sickness and death lingering in the air. Many prisoners were too weak to speak, too dehydrated to even lift their heads. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to save them, but for many the human body had been pushed too far. Even in freedom, they slipped away within days. Others clung to life with astonishing resilience, slowly recovering strength, rediscovering their names, their histories, their sense of self after years of being reduced to a number stitched onto a striped uniform. For some survivors, Liberation was not a single day, but a long, painful process of reclaiming humanity. The Americans quickly turned Flossenburg into a makeshift hospital. Tents and barracks were converted into treatment centers. Prisoners suffering from typhus, tuberculosis, starvation, and infected wounds received antibiotics, warm meals, clean clothes, and beds for the first time in years. Many survivors later described that first piece of real bread or the first warm blanket as more overwhelming than liberation itself. Yet liberation also forced them to confront terrifying questions. Had their families survived? Was their home still standing? Was there any life left waiting for them beyond the barbed wire? In many cases, the answer was no. Countless survivors walked out of Flossenburg only to discover that their towns had been destroyed, their families murdered, and their communities erased. A new struggle began, not to survive the Nazis, but to survive the aftermath. For the local population, the revelation of what had existed in their backyard shattered many illusions. Villagers had known prisoners were marched past them each day and had seen the smoke rising from the camp. Some had worked alongside prisoners in factories or quarries. Others claimed they had no idea what was happening behind the fences. After liberation, American authorities forced civilians from Flossenburg and surrounding towns to walk through the camp, to look at the bodies, to confront what had been done in their midst. Some wept, some protested, some remained silent. The truth stood in front of them, undeniable. In the months after liberation, American forces detained SS guards, camp officials, and kapos who had abused prisoners. Investigations began almost immediately. Dozens of those responsible were brought to trial in what became known as the Flossenburg trials, held by the US military. Evidence included eyewitness testimonies, camp records, photographs, and physical inspection of the sites of execution and torture. Many SS men defended themselves with the usual refrain that they were following orders, but survivors spoke of beatings, murders, starvation, and unspeakable cruelty. Several SS officers from Flossenburg were sentenced to death. Others received long prison terms. Though justice could never balance the suffering inflicted, the trials established a record that could not be denied. Meanwhile, the camp itself underwent a transformation. At first, it served as a displaced persons centre, then as housing for refugees from Eastern Europe, then as a site for war-related administrative functions. The crematorium remained standing, its brick chimney towering as a stark reminder. For years after the war, the memory of Flossenburg existed largely in the minds of survivors and their families. The village around it resumed life. Children played where prisoners once marched, and the barracks fell into decay. Memory, like the buildings, eroded slowly. Yet survivors refused to let the history disappear. By the 1950s and 1960s, survivors' groups began advocating for a proper memorial. They demanded that the execution yard, the crematorium, and the locations of the barracks be protected. In 1958, 20 years after the camp opened, an official memorial was created, but it was small, modest, and insufficient to capture the magnitude of what had happened. Over the following decades, the memorial site expanded. Exhibitions were added, historical panels were installed, barrack foundations were marked, more testimonies were collected. Survivors returned with families, standing on the same ground where they had once faced death and told their stories. Their voices shaped the memorial more than any historian could. By the late 20th century, Flossenburg became recognized as one of the central sites of Nazi forced labor and execution, especially for political prisoners and resistance members. In the early 2000s, a dramatic redesign of the memorial site created a modern museum that blended the preserved ruins with powerful visual documentation. The new exhibition emphasized the multinational character of the prisoners, the brutality of the forced labor system, and the final mass evacuations and death marches that claimed thousands more lives. School groups began visiting regularly. Scholars published new research. Survivors, now elderly, continued to speak, sometimes walking slowly through the camp as they recounted where they had slept, where they had worked, where friends had died. Their presence turned the memorial into living history. One of the most striking aspects of Flossenburg's remembrance is the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whose execution at the camp became symbolic of the internal German resistance to Hitler. His final days, letters, and theological writings have been studied worldwide, and many visitors come specifically to see the place where he was killed. But the memorial has worked hard to ensure that Bonhoeffer is not remembered alone. He was one victim among many. Poles, Soviets, Jews, Czechs, French, Italians, Spaniards, Dutch, Danes, Belgians, Norwegians, Roma, and countless others endured the same suffering. The camp's story belongs to all of them. As decades passed, the silence of the post-war years gave way to a more open and honest confrontation with history. The village of Flossenburg gradually embraced the need to remember. Local teachers incorporated the camp's history into their lessons. Residents guided visitors. Partnerships formed with universities, survivor organizations, and museums abroad. The camp, once a place designed to erase people, now became a place dedicated to preserving their names and stories. Today, walking through the memorial, one sees the stone foundations of the barracks outlined in gravel, the execution yard marked by a simple plaque, and the crematorium preserved exactly as it was in 1945. The quarry, now quiet, looms in the background like a sleeping giant, its walls bearing the scars of forced labour. The path that prisoners once marched at dawn is lined with trees. The silence is deep but filled with meaning. It invites visitors not only to reflect on the past, but to consider what human beings are capable of, both in cruelty and in endurance. Understanding Flossenburg also means understanding its place within the larger machinery of the Nazi concentration camp system. Unlike extermination camps that existed purely for murder, Flossenburg belonged to a category where forced labour itself became a method of extermination. The SS believed that a prisoner's value was measured solely by how long he could work before collapsing. This ideology created a system where torture was not only random but structural, built into every part of camp life. The long march to the quarry, the insufficient food, the lack of medical care, the relentless pressure to meet unrealistic labour quotas, and the ever-present threat of punishment all ensured that prisoners lived in a constant state of physical and psychological destruction. Many did not survive more than a few months. As the camp expanded, the SS created a rigid hierarchy among prisoners. Kapos, prisoners appointed as overseers, were granted privileges, extra food, and authority in exchange for enforcing discipline. Some capos abused their power brutally, becoming extensions of the SS. Others attempted to protect fellow prisoners, sabotaging production, hiding the sick, or secretly sharing food. This hierarchy created deep tensions and moral dilemmas that survivors struggled with long after the war. Many felt guilt for actions taken under extreme duress, while others felt guilt simply for surviving when so many had died. Flossenburg was not only a place of physical suffering, but a place where moral boundaries were twisted by the unimaginable pressures of survival. Religion played a complicated role in the camp. Many prisoners, stripped of all possessions and dignity, clung to spiritual beliefs as a source of hope. Secret prayers were whispered in the barracks after lights out. Tiny scraps of paper with verses or blessings were hidden beneath mattresses or under rocks. In some cases, prisoners formed quiet circles of reflection or worship, knowing that discovery could lead to punishment. The presence of clergy imprisoned for resisting Nazism added a unique dimension to Flossenburg's story. Figures like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, along with Catholic priests and ministers from across Europe, became sources of moral strength for others. Their calm, their refusal to surrender their principles, and their compassion in the face of brutality provided a rare light in the darkness. Even for non-religious prisoners, the steadfastness of these individuals left a lasting impact. The multinational nature of Flossenburg created a mosaic of languages, cultures, and identities forced together under horrific conditions. Communication was often difficult, yet friendships and alliances formed across linguistic barriers. Prisoners shared what little they had, taught each other words, consoled the dying, and exchanged stories about their homes. These connections became lifelines. They reminded prisoners that beyond the barbed wire lay a world of families, traditions, and humanity worth fighting to return to. In the darkest times, a simple gesture, a stolen potato, a whispered warning, a supportive hand on a shoulder, could be the difference between life and death. Survivors later spoke of these small acts as evidence that even within the camp's cruelty, human solidarity endured. Forced labour in the armaments industry added another layer to the prisoner experience. Factories carrying the Messerschmitt name, among others, used prisoner labour to produce crucial components for aircraft prisoners' operated machinery, assembled parts, and maintained equipment while constantly monitored by guards. Sabotage became one of the few ways prisoners could fight back. Some deliberately weakened welds, misaligned parts, or slowed production whenever they could do so without detection. These acts of resistance carried extreme risk, as discovery meant torture or execution. Yet many prisoners took that risk, refusing to contribute fully to the machinery of war that had destroyed their lives. Their acts of quiet defiance, though small in scale, expressed a deep refusal to surrender their humanity. As the war turned against Germany, the atmosphere in the camp grew increasingly unstable. The SS became more unpredictable, alternating between panic, denial, and heightened brutality. Rumours circulated among prisoners about Allied advances, often conflicting and unreliable. Some believed liberation was weeks away. Others feared the SS would murder the remaining prisoners before retreating. The tension was almost unbearable. Every distant rumble of artillery, every movement of guards, every change in the daily routine felt charged with meaning. In these final months, the mortality rate soared. Starvation, disease, exhaustion, and the cold overwhelmed the weakened population. The crematorium worked constantly, its chimney releasing a grim reminder of the escalating tragedy. When the SS finally ordered the evacuation of the camp, the resulting death marches became one of the most horrific episodes in Flossenburg's history. Prisoners were forced to march for days without food, sleep, or medical care. Those who faltered were shot by the roadside. Columns of starving prisoners wound through villages and forests, leaving behind bodies that marked their routes like a trail of suffering. Some prisoners escaped into the woods, surviving on sheer willpower. A few found sympathetic locals who hid them in barns, basements, or attics. Despite the danger, others were not so lucky, captured again or killed by guards. These marches continued until the prisoners were either liberated by advancing Allied forces or perished along the way. Meanwhile, inside the camp, the prisoners too sick to march clung to life in uncertainty. Many expected to be executed. Others simply waited, their bodies too weak to move. When American soldiers arrived, they found these survivors in unimaginable conditions. Liberation was chaotic and emotional. Some prisoners were euphoric, others were too traumatized to react. American soldiers shared their own rations, lifted prisoners into ambulances, and tried to bring order to the scene. Yet even amid the relief, many survivors were haunted by the absence of their loved ones. The collective grief that followed liberation was profound and indescribable. Flossenburg's legacy after the war became a long conversation between memory and silence. Survivors wrote memoirs, gave testimonies, and worked tirelessly to ensure that their experiences would not be forgotten. Yet many also carried their pain quietly, unable to speak about the horrors they endured. Communities across Europe struggled to understand what had happened to the millions who disappeared, and Flossenbürg became one of many places where families found either answers or more questions. The camp became a symbol not only of oppression but of the resilience of those who endured it. The long-term legacy of Flossenburg unfolded not only in the immediate aftermath of the war, but across generations, shaping the political, cultural, and moral landscape of post-war Europe. In the earliest years after 1945, the memory of Flossenburg was fragmented, scattered across the experiences of thousands of survivors who returned to different countries, each facing their own reconstruction, grief, and political realities. For many, returning home did not bring closure. Instead, it introduced new forms of alienation, communities that no longer existed, families that had been extinguished, neighbors who had collaborated with the occupiers or who did not want to hear about the horrors that had taken place. Survivors often found themselves caught between the need to remember and the world's desire to forget. Their voices, however, were crucial in establishing the historical record. Through memoirs, interviews, and court testimonies, they painstakingly reconstructed the events that had unfolded in Flossenburg, ensuring that future generations could not claim ignorance. The process of reckoning with Flossenburg's past played out unevenly across the nations involved. In some countries, survivors were welcomed as heroes or martyrs of resistance. In others, they were met with indifference or suspicion. Many survivors discovered that returning home brought political obstacles. In the Soviet Union, for example, former POWs and concentration camp prisoners were often treated as potential traitors, interrogated and sometimes imprisoned again by Stalin's regime. Their suffering at German hands did not spare them from new hardships. In Western Europe, survivors sometimes struggled with survivors' guilt, unemployment, physical disabilities, and psychological trauma. Some spoke freely about what they had endured. Others stayed silent for years, even decades, because the memories were too painful or because they feared they would not be believed. Flossenburg's legacy thus became intimately tied to the broader story of post-war displacement, trauma, rebuilding, and the slow emergence of a human rights framework that recognized the rights and dignity of victims of state violence. In Germany itself, the story of Flossenburg reflected the country's long and often difficult process of confronting the crimes of the Nazi regime. In the immediate post-war years, German society was physically and psychologically devastated. Many civilians claimed ignorance of what had happened in the camps. Others tried to distance themselves from complicity. The Americans forced villagers from Flossenburg and the surrounding towns to confront the evidence with their own eyes. But after Allied occupation ended, German remembrance entered a period of silence. The Cold War shifted political priorities, and many former Nazis reintegrated into society only gradually through the work of historians, journalists, and especially survivors did Flossenburg re-emerge in public consciousness. By the 1960s and 70s, younger generations began demanding answers from their parents and grandparents. Schools started teaching about the camps. Memorials expanded. The camp became a site of conscience where German society wrestled with its own past. In the 1980s and 90s, a wave of scholarship transformed historical understanding of Flossenburg. Researchers uncovered vast networks of subcamps, documented the economic role of forced labor, and gathered testimonies from survivors around the world. This research revealed patterns that were poorly understood before: how companies profited from prisoner labor, how the SS bureaucracy managed exploitation, how different prisoner groups were treated, and how the camp's functions evolved from stone extraction to mass labor for armaments production. These findings deepened the complexity of Flossenburg's story, moving it beyond simplistic narratives of good and evil and toward a more nuanced recognition of how ordinary institutions, businesses, local governments, military units, became entangled in the machinery of persecution. This renewed understanding of Flossenburg's history led to a major transformation of the memorial site itself in the early 2000s. Historians, architects, survivors, and local officials collaborated to create a modern educational center that would preserve the authenticity of the site while providing a comprehensive narrative. The new exhibition incorporated testimonies, photographs, documents, personal artifacts, and interactive displays that allowed visitors to engage deeply with the stories of individuals who had lived and died there. The redesign emphasized the human dimension of the camp. Instead of focusing solely on statistics or general descriptions, it highlighted personal experiences, letters smuggled between prisoners, drawings made secretly in the barracks, scraps of clothing preserved by families, and the stories of friendships that formed under the most unlikely circumstances. Among the many complex themes explored in the memorial, one of the most striking is the diversity of Flossenburg's prisoner population. Unlike some camps that held mostly one group, Flossenburg was a crossroads of nations. Each nationality experienced the camp in distinct ways, shaped by Nazi ideology and wartime politics. Soviet POWs faced systematic extermination poles, especially political prisoners, endured brutal labor and torture. Jews arrived in larger numbers only in the later years, often after surviving earlier deportations, ghettos, and camp evacuations. Their arrival dramatically increased the death toll in 1945. French and Dutch resistance fighters were often executed shortly after arrival. Germans who opposed Hitler were treated with particular cruelty. Clergy, including Catholic priests from Poland and Protestant ministers from Germany, formed a unique community bound by faith and moral conviction. Roma prisoners faced racial persecution. Each group brought unique languages, cultures, and stories into the camp. Today, memorial plaques in many languages pay tribute to this multinational suffering. Another major theme is the role of the SS staff and the structures that enabled their crimes. Flossenburg's guards, officers, medical staff, and administrators were not isolated monsters. They were part of a bureaucratic system that normalized cruelty. The SS drew heavily from ideologically committed individuals, but many were motivated by career ambitions, conformity, or fear of disobedience. Their brutality was shaped by training, propaganda, and peer pressure. Some guards beat prisoners to assert dominance. Others enforced rules mechanically, hiding behind orders. A few showed occasional moments of humanity, though these moments did not erase their participation in a system of mass oppression. Understanding the perpetrators enhances understanding of how such atrocities became possible. It reveals the danger of dehumanization, the fragility of moral boundaries, and the way systems can shape individuals' behavior for better or worse. The educational programs at Flossenburg today aim to connect these historical themes to contemporary questions. What conditions allow totalitarianism to thrive? How do ordinary people become complicit in injustice? How can societies resist hatred, discrimination, and state violence? Students from around the world visit the camp to reflect on these questions. Workshops encourage them to analyze primary sources, study survivor testimonies, and discuss ethical dilemmas faced by individuals during the war. Some students write reflections comparing their own freedoms to the experiences of prisoners. Others create art or documentaries inspired by what they learn. The memorial has become not only a site of history, but a place where new generations confront the realities of moral responsibility. At a personal level, many powerful stories continue to emerge from Flossenburg. Survivors' children and grandchildren often visit the camp to trace their family histories. They walk through the ruins, searching for a sense of connection, imagining what their relatives went through, reading the names inscribed on memorial walls. These visits create emotional bridges across time, linking past suffering to present life. Some families scatter the ashes of a survivor who wished to return to the place where they endured so much. Others bring young children, hoping to instill in them a deep awareness of the past. These intergenerational moments transform Flossenburg into a space of remembrance and healing. Some of the most emotional moments at the memorial occur during reunions. Survivors from different countries occasionally return at the same time, meeting each other decades after they were liberated. They share memories, sometimes joyful, sometimes heartbreaking, of individuals who helped them survive. They recall small acts of kindness: a prisoner who shared his bread, a doctor who risked punishment to hide medicine, a friend who offered encouragement during despair. These conversations highlight the resilience of solidarity. Even in the harshest conditions, survivors often express profound gratitude that their stories are being preserved, that the world has not forgotten what happened here. The story of Flossenburg also includes remarkable examples of resistance. While armed resistance was nearly impossible, prisoners found other ways to defy their oppressors. They sabotaged machinery, slowed down production, shared forbidden news about Allied advances, secretly wrote poetry, composed songs, and created small artistic works to maintain their identity. Religious and cultural rituals were practiced in secret. Some prisoners used their positions to protect others: kapos who refused to abuse the weak, clerks who manipulated records to spare prisoners from execution, doctors who hid the sick to prevent selection. These quiet acts of resistance demonstrated that even under total domination, human beings found ways to assert their dignity. One cannot fully understand Flossenburg without considering the emotional and psychological impact on survivors long after the war. Many carried invisible wounds: nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, fear of loud noises, and distrust of authority. For some, the trauma never fully healed. They built new lives, marrying, raising families, building careers, but the memories remained present, shaping their inner world. Some spoke about their experiences publicly, giving testimonies to schools, historians, and filmmakers. Others spoke only in private or not at all. Their silence was a form of survival, a way to protect themselves from reliving the past. Yet even silence shaped the legacy, influencing how their children and grandchildren understood their identity and heritage. The memorial today stands as a testament to all these layers of history. Walking through the remaining structures, one senses the weight of the past. The crematorium stands intact, its brick walls cold and imposing. The execution yard is quiet, marked by a simple plaque and surrounded by greenery that contrasts sharply with the memories of brutality. The outlines of the barracks, marked only by stone foundations, evoke the presence of thousands who lived and died there. The quarry looms in the background, its cliffs carved by forced labour, a silent monument to the exploitation that sustained the Nazi war effort. The air feels heavy with memory, but also filled with a sense of responsibility. Visitors feel compelled to listen, to reflect, to remember. Flossenburg is not simply a historical site, it is a warning, an enduring reminder of what can happen when hatred, prejudice, and authoritarianism are allowed to flourish unchecked. It teaches that genocide does not begin with gas chambers or mass executions, but with small acts of discrimination, with the dehumanization of certain groups, with the erosion of rights, with silence in the face of injustice. It shows how ordinary people can become victims or perpetrators depending on the choices they make and the society they support. Through its exhibitions, educational programs, and memorial events, Flossenburg continues to speak to the present, urging vigilance against intolerance and reaffirming the importance of human dignity. Today, the global significance of Flossenburg is evident in the many scholars, students, and visitors who travel from around the world to study its history. It stands alongside Auschwitz, Dachau, and Mauthausen as one of the major sites that define public understanding of the Holocaust and Nazi terror. Yet it also holds its own unique place in history, a camp shaped by forced labour, by the execution of resistance members, by multinational suffering, by late-stage chaos and death marches, and by the extraordinary courage of prisoners who faced impossible circumstances. Its story is not overshadowed by larger camps. Rather, it complements and deepens understanding of the complex system of persecution that characterized the Nazi regime. Perhaps the most important lesson of Flossenburg is that memory is a living force. It changes as new information emerges, as new generations engage with history and as societies evolve. Every testimony, every archival discovery, every visit to the memorial adds another layer to the story. Memory is not about dwelling in the past. It is about shaping a more humane future. The voices of survivors echo through the halls of the memorial, urging visitors to see the individuals behind the statistics, to recognize the courage hidden in despair, and to understand the fragility of freedom. In the end, the story of Flossenburg is not solely one of suffering, but also of resilience, solidarity, and the enduring power of human dignity. It reminds us that even in places designed to break the human spirit, people found ways to remain human. They shared food, whispered prayers, comforted the dying, resisted quietly, and held onto fragments of hope. Their legacy lives on in the memorial, in the stories passed down through families, in the lessons taught to students, and in the commitment of future generations to defend human rights. Flossenburg's stone and silence speak across time, urging us never to forget and never to repeat the horrors that unfolded there. If you found this video meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps more people hear and remember these stories.